Well, hello. Thank you all for coming to the ProSocial World Research Seminar Series. My name is Beth Hawkins. I'm ProSocial World's Director of Research. And we kicked off this series recently, and I'm really thrilled by the interest and turnout for our speakers so far. The previous two presentations were focused on evolutionary science and theory. Specifically dual inheritance theory and a theoretical examination of the symbotype-phenotype relationship. So today we will hear a different perspective from the contextual behavioral science, and the session title is Understanding Language and Thought, Creating Context for Behavior Change. So now I'm just absolutely pleased and quite honored to present today's presenters. Two brilliant, beautiful people, ProSocial's own Dr. Paul Atkins, he's the vice president and co-founder of ProSocial World, and Dr. Robert Stiles, he's ProSocial World's director of learning and engagement. So Paul, take it away.
Thanks so much, Beth. It's a delight to be here, and it's a delight to see all of your faces virtually. Settling in to being here. Let me share my screen and we'll take it away. The first thing I want to say is all of this work is very much a collaboration with Robert Stiles, who I'm not sure if he's managed to arrive yet. I know he was also having trouble with the link, but I think he's now probably found his way here. So this has been very much a collaborative effort over a number of years. Robert did his PhD with me, but I have to be honest, I was very much learning this stuff as we went together. Oh, just realizing we're not fully dressed here. Better get dressed properly. All right, so we're going to talk about the behavioural science of ProSocial World, and our intention for these two talks is to provide enough of a background to a behavioural way of thinking that we collectively, this talk was really written for the community, for you. It was written for the ProSocial World staff and for our whole community, in the hope that we might appreciate a bit more the value of a behavioural way of viewing the world. That you might see the consilience with evolutionary science, and that we might begin to use some of the concepts in our collaborations and inform the design of what we're doing with ProSocial using behavioural science. So who are these talks for? Well, obviously intelligent, warm, kind, friendly folks such as yourself. As I said, it's really for our community, and the intention is to be a kind of tutorial almost in behavioural science. So we're going to get pretty geeky in this. I will try to make it entertaining and relevant and pragmatic, but we are going to get pretty geeky. And so if you're not here for geekiness, then possibly tune out, make yourself some dinner or breakfast, and watch the recording on double speed, although I think that might blow your mind. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about my learning history, my background. Many years ago, I did a PhD at Cambridge University in this building, the Medical Research Council Applied Psychology Unit building in Cambridge, or just outside Cambridge. And that office just there was the office of the head of the unit, my supervisor, Professor Alan Badley, a man who I just looked up, and he's still alive at 89, and is someone I love dearly, very kind man. But he was, at that time, I was a cognitive scientist. That's what I had learned. And so we were learning about things like the central executive, this kind of homunculus inside the human that made choices, and the visuospatial sketchpad, where things were stored in short-term memory or working memory. And I have to say, I have to be honest, throughout my entire PhD, there's Robert. Great, it's nice to have you here, mate. Glad you're able to make it. Throughout my entire PhD, I was thinking to myself, where is this visuospatial sketchpad? What is it? And more concerningly than that, is this really science? You know, we're making up these things and then we're kind of ascribing properties to them. And so a lot of what this talk is about is how can we have a natural science of behaviour that doesn't involve us creating a sort of dualism between mind and body, and there's special mind stuff that has special properties that we can just ascribe to it. But I will say that with that training as a cognitive scientist, it's left me feeling a bit like an imposter in the behavioural science areas, because, you know, I feel like I come from a different school almost. The good thing about that is I think I've also struggled with it so hard for 15 years to learn the ideas that I'm going to present to you in this talk that I'm very, very sympathetic for where we can go wrong. So today I want to talk to you a bit about the challenge of collaboration. I want to talk about a key thing, three other key pieces. The unit of analysis for this natural science of behaviour is the act in context. And I want to talk to you about learning as selection by consequences, i.e. adaptation. Then I'd like to talk to you about the one behaviour that changes everything. And I'll leave that hanging just because it's kind of be a little bit enticing. I'll give you a clue, it's language, but I'll tell you a bit more about how we see language. And then I think I would like to finish up with why we should all speak a little behaviouralese, and three key points that I think fall out of this. Next time, in this session, Robert may step in if he feels so moved. I might ask him at the end to add anything. But next session is going to be his opportunity to do the majority of the presenting, and he'll be presenting his thesis work, which was all about self-rules and rule-governed behaviour, and he'll talk about that in context of individual and collective action and how this thinking has informed the 7 core processes of ProSocial, why symbotypes can be better understood as learned behaviour, and he'll also be linking in Ostrom's work to what we're doing. So there's an awful lot of material in this, and we're really hoping that we can be of service to the community. So let's think about some collaborative challenges. It's a core tenet of this approach is to connect with why are we doing this? This is all about pragmatism. And so ultimately, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to solve some of these sorts of challenges. A team member dominates conversations, and we want to change their behaviour or change the behaviour of the team so that time is distributed more equitably. Or maybe 2 teams within an organisation are competing and we want them to collaborate more. Or one that Robert and I are working on at the moment, 4 United Nations agencies want to work out how to better collaborate to reduce the risk of zoonotic pandemics. Or Russia invades Ukraine and we want them to withdraw. It doesn't really matter what the scale is. In every case, we have a situation where we've got a situation and we want to influence some kind of behaviour that creates a new and better situation. So we want a technology that can help us at every scale. And we don't want that technology to just be what Joe Bloggs thinks is a good way to resolve competition. And we don't want it just to be out of the head of one person based on their particular learning history. We want it to be cumulative and we want it to be collaborative. That is, we want a science of behaviour, a genuine science of behaviour that will help us. So let's start thinking about how we frame up the question for this science of behaviour. What's our core challenge? Well, first of all, I thought, when I first asked myself that, I thought, okay, maybe it's influencing people to be more pro-social. That makes sense. But actually, even in that little move, we've already lost the plot. We've already started to see people as things with particular forms, characteristics, and we're trying to change the form of them from being less pro-social to being more pro-social. If we frame up the question as creating contexts that increase the likelihood of pro-social behaviour, we're much more in the space of a behavioural science, a genuine behavioural science, because we can affect contexts. We can't, and we don't even want to, set out to change people. We want to set out to create contexts that increase the likelihood of pro-social behaviour. Ostrom was deeply contextualist in this way. She said in her Nobel Prize speech, a core goal of public policy should be to facilitate the development of institutions that bring out the best in humans, create a context that brings out the best. All right, so let's get down to first principles. And I did say this was intended for people without any knowledge of this space. What do we mean by behaviour? Well, behavioural science gets weird right from the start. Most people think of behaviour as being anything, the stuff that we see, you know, moving arms and legs, speaking, smiling, etc. But behaviour from this perspective is anything an organism does or can do. So it can be visible and public, but it can also be private. Thinking, feeling, visualizing, empathizing, trusting, imagining, sensing, planning, all of these activities, our entire inner world is behaving. It just happens to be private, but that's just a distinction of who can see it. It's still subject to the same evolutionary laws, if you like, of variation, selection, and retention of what works in context. I'm going to come back to that again and again and again, that these internal behaviours have the same dynamics. They're learned and they respond to a learning history. So then if that's behaviour, what is the cause of behaviour? Well, from a behavioural science point of view, it's the context. And we understand the context as everything else, like literally everything else in all time is a potential context. But this is not an ontological model. It's not a model of the way reality is. This is a model about, it's an epistemological model. It's a model of how we can come to know reality, how we know about reality. And so we limit our investigation of context to the stuff that we think is relevant as a cause of the behaviour. And what might be relevant for this behaviour right now, for me speaking right now? It's, you know, the Zoom link, the history of my friends helping to promote this talk and share it amongst us. But it's also the historical influences upon me, my learning history, and even my genetics, my capacity to speak and your capacity to listen. So all of those things are present potentially as context, but we're looking for the bits that we think are most relevant for the behaviour, creating the behaviour. And of course, once we're behaving, we're shaping the context. So as the Buddhists say, we're independent co-arising. There's no separation. There's only behaviour and context. And really, those things, we're only separating those because we're trying to do science. There isn't actually a fundamental distinction between the two. So the unit of analysis for behavioural scientists is the act in context. It's the behaviour in context. And I want to show you now, a pigeon learns to peck a yellow disc in the presence of an image of a car. So in this case, apologies for going back to Skinner here, Skinner boxes and so forth, and confirming all the stereotypes of behaviourists. But this is a really nice controlled environment where you can see that you can train up a pigeon that in the presence of this stimulus, a picture of a car, they should peck a yellow dot. And the pigeon learns that if they peck the yellow dot in the presence of that stimulus, it's quite likely that food will appear. So we can understand that. Let's try and represent this situation graphically. And this is one of the core things that we'll return to again and again. In the presence of a picture of a car, peck at a yellow dot, And the pigeon has learned from previous behavior that it's quite likely that as a consequence of that behavior, food will appear. And food is a pet if they want to move toward it. This is what's called the operant by Skinner. Skinner called this the operant. It was meant to indicate that the behavior is operating on the environment. But this whole thing, the behavior in the context of both all the learning history about and all the evolutionary background and so forth, and the history of consequences is the unit of analysis that we're focused on. Now, I want to just note that this is like a kind of timeline. There's a context, there's some behavior, and then there's some kind of consequence. That makes sense in time. But when we represent it like this, there's a real risk that we might do something, and I did this many, many times as a cognitive scientist. I would say something like, in this context, the pigeon pecks because they know that that will give them food, or because they intend to get food, or because they want food. All of those things, we're suddenly invoking this mind thing that is kind of at least fuzzy. Well, there are minds. We have minds, but I'm going to talk to you about how behavioural scientists views that later. The important point here is that the future can't cause behaviour. We don't have final causes in a natural science. We have a history of learning that in particular circumstances, if I do this thing, then I'll be likely, or I've had the experience of creating a consequence. So this is a probabilistic thing where, yeah, I don't know how else to say it other than it's our history, if you like. Even the capacity to imagine the future is caused by the past, as we'll find out, as we'll show you later. All right, so let me give you a more practical example. I think I need to anchor this down. So the other day, Robert and I went to a fancy restaurant together, and I needed to go to the bathroom, and I went to wash my hands, and it wasn't a tap like that. I would have known what to do with that. It wasn't one like that. I would have known that you need to pull out the tap. It wasn't even one of those funny ones where you have to wave your hands in front of it. The tap looked a little bit like that. It wasn't actually quite as obvious as that. It was even less subtle. And I had no idea what to do with this tap, whether to push it back or whether to turn it or what to do. And so I jiggled it around a bit and eventually kind of worked out that you had to push it back and turn it at the same time, and it eventually released water at non-scalding temperature. So that was good. The important thing is I learnt to do that through trial and error learning, by seeing what consequences happened when I tried out different things. And a lot of human behaviour is like this. It's based in trial and error learning. There were a lot of words there, like, you know, oh God, I must be stupid. I can't even work out how to turn on a tap. Or this will make a great example in my behavioural talk. Those words weren't helping me at all. The thing that helped me was the moving of the tap, trial and error learning. So a lot of our behaviour is like that. For example, I'll tell you a little trick that I sometimes play in talks. When I'm listening to someone, every time the speaker looks at me, I smile at them. I give them a big smile. And after a little while, you'll notice that you've trained them to just look at you all the time because, you know, obviously they're being reinforced by the smiling. So there you go. That was my subtle clue to reinforce me by smiling at me from time to time. All right. So this is called operant learning. Now, I know it's a technical term and I don't want to really focus on the words, but these words get used and it creates a language that we can potentially share and collaborate with. Selecting by consequences, trial and error learning, if you like. I think I've said all of this. It was called an operant because it operates on the environment to produce consequences or reduce the presence of aversive consequences. This is evolution of behaviour. It's variation and selective retention in context of behaviour that works. So it's either, and the organism is either helping to create a new niche for itself, or it's adapting itself to its environment. A key thing to note about this, and it's really hard to wrap your head around, is this is entirely about functionalism. It's not about the form. The unit of analysis is not just the behaviour, it's the behaviour in a context. So on the left, we've got here Barack Obama doing something. What's he doing? He's waving goodbye. Here we've got a woman cleaning a window. She's doing more or less the same move. It's the same topography, but from a behaviour analyst point of view, from trying to understand this, we don't say these are the same behaviours. We say that this is waving goodbye and this is cleaning a window. What am I doing right now? Well, if you're interested in pedagogy, you'd say that I'm teaching. If you're interested in the medical effects of vocal cords, you could say that I'm uttering sounds. If you're interested in linguistics, you could say that I'm talking. It depends both on the speaker and the listener. When we investigate, this is just me to make this point again, this is an epistemological model. We are investigating the behaviour in context because that helps us make sense. I think many times in society, we make the mistake of focusing on form instead of function. And I'll give you one huge example that's relevant for mental health practitioners and from a behavioural point of view, is the entire field of mental health, the entire framing of it as a form. Depression is defined by being in a depressed mood most days, much of the day, by feeling fatigued, by feeling, experiencing weight loss. It's defined by the appearance of depression. That doesn't help us at all in dealing with it. And it's just arbitrary. Depression can take many forms. Instead, we can look at it as a function in context, a response to the world that kind of makes sense. So one implication for our research as ProSocial World is that we need to understand the context that evoke and sustain behaviour for each person. And to do that, it's less useful for us to do surveys of lots of people and average the results, and more useful for us to explore the contingencies. What are the consequences that people are working to create? Okay, so back to our pigeon. If you say to the pigeon, danger, don't peck, he'll probably look at you like this. And then he'll go back to pecking. So pigeons don't have language. I've given you a bit of a taste of the idea of the act in context. Let's come back to thinking about prosociality. I said one of our challenges at the beginning that I introduced was two teams within an organisation are competing and we want them to collaborate more. So far what we've learned would kind of give us the impression that maybe what we need to do then is reward the team members when they collaborate or punish those who engage in competitive behaviour. After all, haven't I just said to you that this operant learning is all about developing a learning history of receiving particular consequences in the presence of particular behaviours? Well, we all know that those things are unlikely to work very well in many contexts. And not to say they won't work in every context, but in many human contexts, giving people rewards is going to make them game the system, and punishing them is going to make them leave the organisation. So there's a good chance that's not going to work real well. And unfortunately, behaviourism was kind of stuck in this place of rewards and punishment for many, many years. But modern behavioural thinking is far more sophisticated than that. And here are some other strategies that we might engage in. We might teach them how to cooperate more effectively, or we might ask them what needs competition is meeting for them. Maybe it's meeting a need for self-esteem. Maybe it's meeting a need for connection to others. Maybe it's meeting a need for excitement, and then look to satisfy those needs in other ways. Now, these two strategies are much more, they involve language, this unique human capability. Actually, all of the strategies involve language because it's the nature of humans that everything involves language. But I just wanted to make the point that those last two rely very heavily on the meaning we're making of the world. All right, let me tell you a little story. The other day, and I'm not going to win Father of the Year for this story, I'm afraid, and I'm a little worried that it's going on a recording, but my daughter was eating a Portuguese tart, or she was about to eat a Portuguese tart, and she had this beautiful looking Portuguese tart. I don't know about you, but I love Portuguese tarts. And I was looking at it and I was thinking, I want some of that Portuguese tart. And so I said to her, hey, V, can I have some of your snot? And I was pointing at the Portuguese tart. And she looked at me like, oh, this isn't her, but that's what she did. And oh, Dad. And then she kind of pushed it towards me and said, you're right, you have some of it. So what was going on there? In an instant, I transformed the meaning of a delicious Portuguese tart into something disgusting. How does that happen? How on earth does that happen? This is the essence of meaning making. We can call it lots of different things. Later, I'll call it relational framing or verbal relating or all sorts of things. But here, I'm just going to call it meaning making. And this is a skill that, as far as we know, is unique to human beings. And we can use what we've already learned about the acting context to understand how this works without having to propose a separate realm of mind that is not subject to the same natural laws as everything we experience. As I'm saying that, I'm kind of conscious there might be people in the audience that are sort of thinking, oh my God, what does that mean? You know, like there's sort of a way in which you might be arcing up against me. But I'm hoping that where we end up is a place where it's not that we're less human and more machine-like, but that we are connected to everything. We are deeply embedded in the world as it is. So I'm hoping you'll stay with me when I keep on dissing the idea of a mind. And to do that, we need to understand one generalized operant behavior, which has the very snappy title, arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding. And I'll introduce what that means later. All right, so let's work up to it. This takes me back to being a dad and teaching my child to read. And I'm looking at a book with her. And in this case, the father points at an image and he says, that's a kangaroo. And the child learns, it's a kangaroo. By the way, in case it's not obvious, I'm speaking to you from Australia. In that moment, meaning making begins. In that moment, the child is learning something about the world. This image, this thing in the world is a kangaroo, and it is bigger than a cat. And later they'll learn it jumps higher than a dog, and so forth. It's beginning language learning. How do behavioural scientists study this? Well, they use an approach that we call match to sample. This is really a little bit like, basically just think of it as multiple choice questions, if you like. So let's do one together. They try and isolate the core elements of what's going on here. So I'm going to show you 3 stimuli, if you like, 3 things, 3 events. I want you to pick the kangaroo. Okay, let's see it in the chat line. What's the response? Is it A, B, or C? Actually, don't worry about it. I'm going to guess that most of you are pretty confident that we got A. Thank you, Michael, for indulging me. I appreciate you. All right, now for a harder one. This is refining your discriminating abilities here. Kangaroo. Okay. Now this one you can actually answer. Which one is it? Beth. Yeah, B. You're champions. That's great, because I was going to say, if anyone put one of the others, this wasn't a quick trick question, actually. A is a wallaby. C is a quokka. We have lots of varieties. I could have picked about another 10 or so different types of kangaroo looking thing in Australia, but they're all kind of different, a little bit different. If you didn't get those, I was going to invite you to come to Australia and I'd show you some of these just out up the road from where I live. Okay, so far we haven't done anything that a pigeon couldn't do. You can teach a pigeon to, when I make this sound, pick this picture. That's something your pigeon could do. The next bit is where it gets a bit wild, and hang on to your hats. I really don't think there's going to be many talks where that image precedes this diving into this paper. But okay, so I'm going to go super geeky here, and I hope you can stay with me, because I think this one study, just chose one study from a corpus of literally thousands of studies, that I think it demonstrates what's going on here in an extraordinary way. And so in this study, Michael Dower and others, they first taught human participants what to do in the presence of these symbols. So in the presence of this symbol, pick the smallest of three stimuli. In the presence of this stimulus, pick the medium-sized one. And in the presence of this one, pick the largest. And they taught that through operant learning by basically saying, correct, or good job, or something, when the person picked the right one. So trial and error learning. They learnt those three things. Then the next thing they did, and again, confirming all your worst suspicions about behaviourists, they were given a small, very small electric shock in the presence of B. Okay, then they measured skin conductance. Now, remember, they got the shock in the presence of the B stimulus, which was this medium-sized one, right? They measured skin conductance. As you'd expect, there was much more arousal for the one that they'd received the shock for than the one where they'd never received a shock, the A stimulus. That's what you'd expect. Pigeon would do the same thing. But a pigeon would also, A and C would be the same levels of arousal, because you've never shown C in the presence of a shock either. Why would that show a greater level of arousal? What humans do is they've essentially learned the relation of size, relative magnitude, and they're applying that relation to this experience of being in the presence of this stimulus C. And they experience more physiological arousal. It shows up as even more scary or frightening, if you want to sort of think of it in mental terms, in the presence of that. Now, I'm guessing I know what you're thinking. I mean, for me, this is absolutely mind-blowing now, because when I look at this, I think, my goodness, this is the very essence of what humans do that is unique, that we relate one thing to another, and we can learn to associate arbitrary symbols to evoke this form of relating, this relating behaviour. But if you're like me, the first sort of 10 years after learning this, about study like this, I was thinking, yeah, well, obviously actually, I'll come back to that point. I'm just going to make another point first. I'm just going to come back to that one in a moment. I've got the ordering. So here we've got the essence of relational framing that in one study, but let's look at it from another perspective. I'm showing you this thing. We all know what this thing is, right? Don't have to name it just yet. But now I'm going to tell you that in spoken Chinese, according to not in spoken Chinese, in simplified Chinese, according to Google Translate. I don't even know what simplified Chinese is, so I feel on very shaky territory here. This thing is a Ningming. Anyone who speaks Chinese, I apologize profusely for the way I just pronounced that. So now I'd like to invite you just to close your eyes for a moment and imagine that it's a hot day and where there's an opportunity in front of you. I'm giving you this big, cold, icy glass of Ningming juice. Do you notice now you can open your eyes again if you like. Do you notice within you, maybe just a little bit of you that was starting to respond physiologically to that? You start to salivate. You've learned that Ningming is like this thing, and we know what this thing is. We've got experience with that. At the same time, you've also derived the back relationship. If I say to you now, what's a Ningming? You'll be able to point to it. Not only that, if I taught you this is the symbol for it, you'd be able to write that symbol after some learning. When I say write the symbol for a Ningming, and if I put that symbol on a page, you'd be able to derive that this is the object. So what we've derived, is going on there is a whole lot of deriving of relationships. This relating behaviour that's at the core of meaning making works even for arbitrary relationships. And I'm again on shaky territory here because I'm in Australia, and these are pictures of nickels and dimes, and that one on the left, as I understand it, is a nickel and that one's a dime. A child would think that, you know, a nickel's bigger than a dime, so presumably it's more important. But we learn culturally that this thing's actually worth less and this thing's worth more. Sorry, that thing's worth less, this thing's worth more. That's arbitrary. That's just a cultural imposition. Mostly I've been talking about in frames of sameness, relating same, one thing being same to another. But I'm just wondering if you can hear my dog barking in the background. Can you? No, you can, Olivia? The dog's going off. But there are lots of other forms of relating that underpin all our meaning making. Coordination, but difference, opposite of. Something is here relative to there. Something is a part of something else. Something's before or after. And then these relations, which are particularly interesting from the point of view of prosociality. If you do this, then this will be the outcome. We can instruct people. Or I am separate to you, this most sophisticated form of relating that is all about relative to me, that there's a separate, that me, I'm me and you're you, and you're there and I'm here. So what? This is the point I was going to make earlier. We learn, we stick stuff in our mind, we store it, what's new? But how do we do that? What if we're trying to create a science of behaviour that doesn't depend on dualism? What if all we can rely upon are natural causes? And we need to understand how this skill could have been acquired without resorting to these metaphors of storage, acquisition and retrieval. And because if we can really understand it, if we can really create a science of behaviour, we're going to be better placed to influence it. So what I'm saying to you, and I don't expect you to get this in one go, but the behaviour of verbal relating is what's called a generalised operant. That is, it's purely functional and it's independent of the form. Another example, just to illustrate this, of what a generalised operant is imitation. This person here is imitating a camel. If I say to you, do this, right? You're going to just see a few people still awake. You can do this. Can we do this? Do this. Do this. Do this. Okay, you've learned the generalized behavior of imitation. Thank you so much for those of you that are playing along. I really appreciate it. And my point here is that this behavior of imitation, it doesn't matter what the form is, it could be anything. It's the function of you copying me. Relational framing is like that. In the presence of appropriate cues, we can relate anything to anything. If you pick three numbers between 1 and 5, I'll just say 1, 3, 4. Okay, how is a phone on top of a child? Well, we kind of can imagine that. We could imagine a phone on top of a child. That's pretty straightforward. What about how is a president better than a trapeze? Okay, I don't know. Maybe they don't keep bouncing back or something like that. I'm not sure in some cases. But we can make a plausible story. We can relate anything to anything. Okay, so I said earlier that we technically call this thing arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding, relational framing, verbal relating. It's all the same thing. It's this behavior. Okay, I want to unpack that term, arbitrarily applicable derived relational responding, not because we expect you to remember it. It's not going to be a test on this, but because thanks to Scott Herbst and his course, Conversational Frame Theory, I just thought this was a really useful way of getting across what this behavior is. And it's the behavior that changes everything about being human. So it's responding, it's behaving, it's something humans do. He unpacks it from the back end, as it were. It's relational responding. And relating just means responding to one thing in terms of another. It doesn't make any sense to say, I'm better. You'll say, better than what? We have to respond to one thing in terms of another. That's the nature of relating. Derived just means without any history of direct training. We weren't taught the stimulus was associated with something scary. We weren't taught that but we derived it. And arbitrarily applicable. It's not based on any intrinsic properties of the related stimuli. There's nothing intrinsic about a dime that says that it's worth more than a nickel. All right. So this, I think, the point I want to make here is that this behavior, and it's hard to wrap your head around, but just think of it as a behavior that serves functions in the world. We learn to do this because it helps us to cooperate. It is the very beginnings of cooperation to learn language so that we can help one another and understand one another. So within our lifetimes, there's an emerging within this field of behavioral science, a story about how we acquire this ability to do relational framing through our life, this behavior. But there's also a story emerging about how phylogenetically it's developed over the course of our evolution. Basically, if you think of the three big C's, cooperation, cognition, and culture, there's a story that we first began to cooperate. Cooperation came first. And from that, we started to, we found it useful to use symbols, grunts, hisses, pointing to refer to things. That enabled us to cooperate even more effectively, and out of that grew language. So we not only learn the meaning of things, we learn from our cultural surrounds how to make meaning. We learn this behavior of making meaning, and it's socially advantageous. All right, so I really want to get onto the applications to prosociality. So I'll just close out this session by saying, we need to really introduce a new term into the operant, which is relational framing or verbal relating or whatever we call it, this behavior of relating one thing to another, because that is private behavior. That is our internal behavior of thinking. I said to you earlier on that behaviorists are interested in anything or everything that a human can do, including loving, being passionate about things, and formulating purpose. Those things shape our public behaviour, and our public behaviour has consequences in the environment, which in turn feed back into a new ongoing context. So let's get real. Why is all of this relevant to the practice of pro-social? Obviously, there's strong theoretical ties, and I know some of you are very interested in evolutionary thinking. So I hope that what I've demonstrated in this is how behavioural science, contextual behavioural science, is really could be thought of as a branch of evolutionary thinking. It is 100% consilient with multi-level selection theory. There's variation and selective retention of behaviour in context. That's the very essence of what behaviourists study. But here I want to focus on some other things that I think would help you make a better pro-social practitioner. The first one is one that just emerged for me initially. Thinking in terms of a learning history, the history of consequences, is a powerful way into compassion. If you look at a lot of methods that are designed to foster compassion, like nonviolent communication or convergent facilitation, the first thing they do is they ask you to essentially identify the needs of the person, which is just another word for consequences. What is this behaviour in the service of? Needs, values, goals, passions, they're all just consequences. They're all something that the service is in, the behaviour is in the service of. Relatedly, it's no accident that our core design principle number one, shared identity and purpose, is the most critical thing to get right with a group. If you do nothing else other than help people to identify their shared identity and purpose, you will have succeeded, because humans are purposeful animals. We respond to the consequences. That's what matters most. Just imagine if I stopped here and I hadn't given this whole technical talk, but we just stopped and all rested in a space where every social context, instead of saying you're wrong, evil, incompetent, we asked, what really matters here to this person? And how could we meet that need in a way that works for all of us? So there's just an invitation. I'm sure many of you already do this, but it's something that I have to learn again and again and again. I get caught up in form. That person said that, that is offensive and I should react. And I lose track of what matters most to me here, what matters most to them, what matters most to us. And one of the things that we're teaching more and more in our courses is getting really good at, when we talk about what matters, there's a continuum of things, from very abstract things like learning or connection through to very specific strategies. I want you to let me know where this talk was confusing. That'll help with my learning. And learning to name a person's needs in terms of whether it's in an abstract general way or in a very specific way can really help us reach convergence in groups. All right. The next thing I really hope that you might be interested in learning a bit more about is our core construct of psychological flexibility. We're trying to teach how people can use the core design principles with psychological flexibility. But over and over again, when I don't give a talk like this, and I'm experimenting, I don't know if this talk will land, if maybe you'll think, God, that was geeky, I didn't get anything out of it. But I'm hoping that you'll get something out of it that will help you to see that psychological flexibility is so much more than just being flexible or putting up with things or resilience. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the idea of psychological flexibility, I'm going to just kind of, I guess I'll introduce it in the next slide. It's broadly speaking, the ability to connect with what really matters to us and to persist in moving in the direction of what really matters to us, even when it feels difficult and aversive. In our view, and I speak from the point of view of, I guess, in my view, but shared with ProSocial World, it is the critical capacity needed to accelerate conscious evolution in both the cultural and behavioural streams. What we want to be able to do is make object, our relating, our dividing up of the world into this and that and you and me and us and them and good and bad. We want to be able to make that object instead of being subject to it, instead of looking through it, because only then can we actually influence many of our most entrenched problems. So this is a definition that was offered of psychological flexibility. It sort of has 6 bits to it, if you like. Being aware of the present moment from the perspective of an observing self, being able to disidentify from our thoughts and to notice thoughts happening instead of being in the thoughts, being able to accept what's already present, not resign to it, but just to allow ourselves to soften in the presence of what's already there, clarifying our values and committing to action. I think I'm going to just move past this definition because I want to wrap up and leave time for some questions which I notice are coming through. So, as I said, the best metaphor, or one of the best metaphors I can think of what I'm calling for here, is to be able to see our relational framing in flight, to move it from being subject to object. Maybe this is what takeout for the call. I really, really want us to stop using the ACT matrix. And here I realize I'm speaking to people who know what the ACT matrix is, but and it's a tool. It's just a tool that happens to ask 5 questions. And over again, I see people approaching it as a problem-solving exercise. But it isn't about answering these questions. It's not about getting the right answers to what matters most to me, or if I was really living in line with this, what would I be doing? It's almost not about, I mean, that matters what the answers are, but that's not the profound aspect of it. The profound aspect of it is just stepping back and asking the questions. It is literally like the movie The Matrix. And I just realized I didn't share sound, but that's okay. I'm going to go without sound. You'll get the basic idea. Do you remember this moment? Yeah, I'm going to share sound because I love this movie. Share sound, share sound. Okay, you remember this moment in The Matrix where Neo sees through the illusion.
He is the one.
Don't you love it? Easily the best film of all time. You might have some debate about that, but I do love that film. So in that moment, he's seeing through this veil of language and he's able to influence what's underneath that. Hey, come here. Come and say hello. My buddy. All right. Wait, move on. Whoa. So we live in 2 evolutionary streams and we can get rigidly stuck into the stream of words. I work too hard, or stay in a job because I think I should. I don't share my feelings in groups because that's what a man is taught to do, etc., etc. All of this training that we do is really about, in psychological flexibility, is allowing us to make it object and to ask, how well is this pattern of relational responding working for me? And how well is it working for us? And the last thing, and we're nearly done, is rule-governed behaviour, which is basically the capacity. The last thing I want to focus on is the capacity to use if-then relating to give instructions to one another. So when you leave this talk, I want you to go outside to the nearest major road. Make sure you don't stare at any drivers with dark sunglasses and black suits. They will kill you if they see you looking at them. Wait for a yellow Prius driven by a little old lady who's bouncing up and down. She will stop. Go with her. She'll drive you to a zoo. Make sure you don't go into the quokka or the wallaby enclosures. If you open the box in there, it will explode and you will be covered in snot. Find the kangaroo enclosure. Jump the fence, and in the back of the enclosure, you'll find $1 million in a box, which you can keep. Now, I'm willing to bet, I know that's preposterous and silly and so on, but in a moment, I just transformed the functions, the effects, if you like, of events in the world. If you were to go outside now and a man drove past in dark sunglasses and black suits, I'm willing to bet you would not lock eyes with them. And if a little old lady stopped and said, come with me, I'm willing to bet you'd go with her in the possibility that you might get $1 million. So in that moment, with a few blah, 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 I was able to create a whole new world inside you. In our next talk, Robert's going to explore how that capacity is shaping our thinking about prosocial with some of these topics. The self, he's going to talk about the 7 core processes of prosocial and how they're shaped by these ideas, and why symbotypes can better be understood as learned behaviours, not things that should be transmitted from one mind to another. And then we'll relate it to Ostrom. So in terms of takeaways, here's some of the key points that I'm hoping you got from this talk. Our core challenge is to change context to make prosocial behaviour more likely. But the human context is only a little bit on the outside. Increasingly, with social media and the internet and so on, the contexts in which we act are becoming more and more verbal. We're becoming more and more living inside this world of words. And that world of words is important. It's reinforced because it helps us to cooperate. But paradoxically, it's also the cause of all our suffering and all our challenges. A functional contextual view of the world is built around the idea of the act in context. It's naturalistic. We don't have to invoke this separate mind thing that has a visuospatial sketchpad and an executive controller that acquires language or stores memory. All of us are a whole being, more or less flexibly learning, adapting and shaping our context by varying and selectively retaining behaviours. There's no right behaviour. There's only behaviours that are more or less effective in achieving the consequences that we say we're hoping to achieve. It's a learned operant behaviour. Once we learn to do it, every single experience in our lives, every moment is saturated with relational responding. We're responding in relation to something else. And of course, I'd have to be complete and say, even this talk, none of this is the truth. It's just a way of speaking that is more or less useful for you. Now, I was going to end at that point, but I woke up this morning at 4 a.m. as you do before a talk like this. And I thought of something that I thought of 10 years ago. And I wanted to just share this with you because I thought it might help to consolidate some of the things that we've been talking about from a different perspective. I was on a meditation retreat and contemplating the 4 Noble Truths. It was a week-long meditation retreat, and I just started learning about relational framing. And I thought, oh my God, the Buddha was talking about relational framing. The Buddha speaks of the truth of life as suffering. The second truth, that there is a cause to suffering, namely clinging and comparison. That there's an end to suffering. There is a way through, and that end is the Noble Eightfold Path. So now I want to offer with all humility my understanding of the 4 Noble Truths through the lens of relational framing. Humans suffer, yes. Suffering, there is a cause of suffering, and it's to do with pain is inevitable because we have to feel cold in order to want to warm ourselves. We must feel fear to know what to avoid. We must experience loss to truly value connection. Suffering is pain plus relational framing. Imagining the future then will be worse than now. Regretting the past when I was there and it was better than here. And falling prey to the illusion of separation. I'm different to everyone else. I'm worse than you or I'm better than you. There is a way out of suffering. And the way out is a different version of the Noble Eightfold Path. To focus on what works to help us move toward what matters most to ourselves in the long term and all of life that supports us. The way out of suffering is to see relational framing for what it is, an adaptive behaviour that we continue to culturally reinforce because it's helped us be the most successful species on Earth in terms of population. It's supercharged our ability to cooperate with one another and to create niches that suit our needs and preferences. But it is ultimately a fiction. There's ultimately no me separate from you. My imaginings of the past and the future bear almost no resemblance to what is. Just as we need fire, but we can't let fire run rampant, we need relational framing more than ever to survive on a planet of 9 billion people. And at the same time, it is literally killing us. The way out of suffering isn't just to not just do more relational framing, more problem solving, but to see our process of problem solving and meaning making in flight. Every duality, me, you, now, then, here, there, better, worse, before, after, valued, unvalued, loved, unloved, hated. If we could make all of that object instead of subject, we could begin to say, I'm no more nor less important than you. I'm no better or worse than you. I'm not separate from you. Like Martin Luther King said, we are all tied in this inescapable web of mutuality, and all there is in this moment is us together, undivided. Thank you.
Wow, Paul. That was amazing. I'm sure that you have plenty hands raised for questions. I'm trying to get my screen open to where I can see the hands. Maybe you could, Paul, if you would like to start fielding. Oh, I think I see Cheryl. Cheryl has her hand up?
Yeah.
Or is there?
You know, this presentation was just so amazing to me because it was just yesterday. I was listening to a woman called, I'm probably really pronouncing her name wrong, Sujatra Baliga, speaking with Thomas Ubel, and they were talking about the difference between the current justice system in the West, okay, specifically America, I guess, and then a restorative justice system. And one's about things and ideas, the other is about relationships, because there's 3 questions one asks as opposed to 3 questions that the other asks.
Mm-hmm.
And this was so cool because think about it. In the current system of justice, the first question is what law was broken? And then who broke it? How should they be punished? It's all externalities, okay? With restorative justice, the 3 questions are who was harmed, back to relationship. What do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs?
Yeah.
All about relationship. Wow. And the fact that I'm hearing both of these things at the same time is just, I don't know, the synergy here is really just amazing to me.
Thank you, Cheryl. I can't add anything to that. It's just a perfect reflection of what I was seeking to convey. So I'm so delighted that you saw that connection. I notice Mature, I'm not sure if I'm saying their name properly. And I'm not even sure if I'm only seeing people that are on video, so I'm not even sure if they're here still.
They are. They are.
Hey,
Paul.
yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You asked this question. Is that question still relevant
Yes,
for
well,
you?
yeah, I mean, in fact, it kind of connects with Cheryl's question. Because I think of justice as a bit broader than that, just in terms of like land rights or rights in general. Like we relate one thing, a subject to an object. And I'm just trying to think of, like, when I say like dyadic, it's this kind of way of just always thinking in twos. And like, is there a way of thinking outside of twos into threes, or ways of relating that a bit broader?
Absolutely. You may recall back to the picture of the lemon and the language of different words and so forth. The beauty of relational framing and why it is a viable model of language. We know that language is generative. We can create wholly new things we've never thought of, and it's infinitely expandable. We can relate anything to anything, and but we can create networks of relations. It's absolutely the case that we can create networks of relations between 3 things or 4 things or 5 things with mutual relations between them. So when we, pretty much any real world natural language involves dozens, thousands, probably hundreds, an entire network of meaning that we've built up over time. I'm not sure if this is speaking to your question, but I have spoken mainly in terms of dualities because it's the primitive of a relationship, responding to one thing in terms of another. But you could be responding to one thing in terms of another, which is related to another, which is related to another. And it could be a network of relations. In fact, that is, of course, the nature of reality. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if anyone has any other questions of anything. Like if you want to say, you know what, what's the point of this? Or anything at all. I'd love to hear from you. Suzanne, thank you.
And X had his hand raised as well.
I'm so sorry. I didn't see those there. Suzanne, yes, please.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, well, do I want to say something or not? I'm thinking about a whole other, when you started and you were talking about, it's all about creating context, I thought you were going to talk about our story. Here we are in this materialistic story, and we really should be in the compassion and caring for each other's story.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's something that, maybe that's a whole other talk or subject. But I just kept thinking as you were talking, no, I just kept going, because that's my model, that we really need to change our story now.
Yeah.
Big time, we need to shift to another context.
Yeah, and look, Suzanne, I have a lot of resonance with the idea of changing the story, changing the narrative, changing the content of what we, and in a way, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think we need to change the story about the way we make meaning. And so I'm less interested in the content of the story, but how we relate to storying itself. The stories we tell ourselves about you're good and I'm bad, or vice versa, or you're separate from me. I tried to frame this as a new story where we can see storying itself in action.
Yeah, more personal.
Because stories are so powerful, as you say. Yeah. In fact, too powerful sometimes.
Yeah. Another thought I had.
Go ahead, please.
Another thought I had, and again, I'm not so sure if I'm in some other framework here, but one of the things I've actually been thinking lately is how much, how ordinary it is for people who, let's say, are good, on the side of the positive, who give you their talks about how to be. And there's so much of what we should be doing. You should this and you should that, and they're right. We should be doing all those things, but I don't think that moves people. I think what moves people is getting excited about the result of whatever it might be. But then I'm back to kind of that story again, you know, and if we get that we're one humanity, it's how thrilling to be here to help the earth, you know?
Yeah, yeah. But I think you're also speaking the same language in terms of you're connecting with purpose, you're connecting with consequences. Maybe I've said it in a more abstract way, but it is the same kind of message, I think. I just realized that I had intended to invite Robert to add anything that he wished to add, and now I can't see Robert. Oh, he's there.
And he has his hand raised, so he's probably all ready to chime in.
Yeah. I just realized that. I'm so sorry, Robert. That was my intention. Anyway, now I'm inviting you in, and then we'll take X and Cabot.
Yeah, no, not at all, Paul. I'm very happy for X and Cabot to speak and ask their questions.
Okay. All right. If you like, we'll go that way, and then you can take your turn. Thank you. X-Mond, I'm sorry.
Yeah, look, I want to thank you, Paul, because I've been kind of reading a lot of this material as a member of ProSocial World, and I've been working with Robert for so long. Robert was my kind of teacher in this space, but I thank you for bringing this in such a beautifully simple, but you framed it in such a way that made all of that very complex material so fresh and relevant, and I thank you for that. It was fantastic. I loved it. But my question to you is, one statement you made at the very beginning when you were talking about antecedent behavior context, that everything is historical and so on, and in light of what you put up there as the Matrix, and I'm a sci-fi fan. I was going to say to you, if tomorrow, and just visualize this, if tomorrow there's a huge object that appeared in the skies above us, right? Now, most of our other species on this planet, if it doesn't do anything, it's just sitting there, would just go about their normal behaviors, right? On the other hand, we, because of perhaps what imagination gives us, would be curious to see what is it. We'd be off in our internal imagination trying to wonder, what is this? Is it a threat? Is it this? Now, an animal species would just assume after a while there's nothing happening. I'll just go about my work. But we would be curious and we would go further. Isn't that a relation to something new and our imagination, in a sense, spurring that? So I guess I'm a little bit confused. I'm just saying, is everything framed in the past? And how is that? Is that the future kind of context?
I see.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so thank you so much. I think what you're picking up on is something that I skated over because it was getting towards the end of the talk. The ABC model, in practice, we need to look at it a little bit differently for humans, because humans do have the potential to imagine, they have the capacity to imagine a possible future. That alien thing might attack us, or it might have people in it that we'd like to meet or something. So in a sense, language obviously allows us to construct a past and a future, and the future can affect our behavior now because we're imagining it. But if you look deeply into that, where does the imagination come from? It comes from the past. It comes from our learning history. It comes from everything that we've ever experienced before. It's said, and I'm not sure if this is true, but it's said that in a similar situation, when Captain Cook arrived on the east coast of Australia, that the Indigenous people of Australia were unable to even see the ship because they had never encountered anything as large as that on the water before. It was just it just ignored it, actually, because it was so alien to their past experience. Of course, that changed, of course, when people came ashore. But, you know, I think what you're getting at is imagining seems to be about the future causing the present. It is in a way, because we can frame up, we can construct a future, but it isn't in the sense of being a natural science that we suddenly now have to postulate something like a final cause, a form that something is moving into or something like that. Does that, am I answering your question at all, or am I getting the wrong end of it?
No, I think I had a feeling that that's what you were going to say. So yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Robert's put his hand down. Robert, do you want to speak? Right.
No, that's what I'm very, I'd rather give those the opportunity to ask questions who want to, because I'll have the floor next time. Yeah.
You will.
There's time,
and I won't get a word in edgewise.
if there's time at the end, I'll chime in, because there is something on my mind, but please, I think Glenn, you're next, aren't you?
Cabot, did you have anything, or did you decided you didn't? No. Yeah.
I think I'm good. I'm not even sure how to formulate the question at this point.
Okay.
So yeah,
Thanks. Glenn.
Yeah, hi.
Love to hear from you.
Thanks for a great talk.
You're welcome.
The question I have, one thing is that you said something about something produces appetite of consequences. I wasn't sure what you're referring to.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I was. I used the word appetitive consequences. So what it was a particular behavior will increase something that I'm trying to get away from mentalistic language. A particular behavior will increase something that we experience as appetitive, which is desirable. It is something that will help us thrive. Or a behavior might reduce an aversive experience. That's the language of reinforcement. I should actually refer to Stu here, can probably help me answer this question better, but you know, that's what I was referring to. Did you have a question about that?
No, I just want to understand. So you're saying basically that you get some kind of benefit through a certain behavior. You keep on repeating it. Is that?
Yeah, that's the nature of the behavior in context, the operant, if you like, that we, you know, I next time I go into that bathroom, I'll repeat the behavior I did last time that worked, because I got a appetitive, what they call in behavioral thinking, appetitive consequence, which just means I like it, I move towards it, which was that the water started coming out, and that reinforced my behavior and increased the likelihood of me doing the same thing again in the future. Or when you smile at me in a talk, I'm going to look at you more often because I find it appetitive reinforcing. That makes sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Great.
I also
Thanks,
have
Glenn.
another question too, if it's okay.
Yeah, please. And then Stu, yep, great.
Yeah, this idea of looking to see what the other person needs, and trying to understand that in terms of like it makes sense sort of if the other person has a a need that I can identify with, but if a person has a need that I don't feel is real, like a fear of something that's out of proportion, you know, like for example, like a fear that a certain political party might come into power and then you know, crime will increase, for example. You know, how do you deal with things that you think that the other person is well, it's not really attached to reality?
Yeah. The first thing I do, and this is this piece about the distinction between strategies and needs, that's not a need to be afraid of, you know, the need there I'd be reaching for is a need for security. You're worried about crime. You're worried about being hurt. That's how I'd connect with that person. I wouldn't, the thing about whether this person or that person gets elected, that's a strategy. That's a behavior in the world, but it's not the underlying need. And so that's how I'd reach across that divide. Does that speak to what you're saying?
Yeah, but then there's an argument of, you know, like if the person never got mugged or there's no violence to that person or to their family, then what am I dealing with here? It seems like I'm dealing with, you know, like words that, you know, things that they've heard in the media, and now they're reacting as if it's a reality.
Yeah, and that's their learning history. And here's where I think it's a beautiful illustration of compassion. So we can go one way. We can say those people are stupid, those people are ignorant, etc., etc. Or we can go another way and say the context in which they operate, the people that they love believe these things. The media that they're reading, the authorities that they respect believe these things. Of course, the context is going to be such that they're going to be believing these things. So all we can do is ask, what are the needs underpinning, what are you really wanting and needing here? And in the end, we're all wanting to connect with one another. We're all wanting safety and security. We're all wanting self-determination. In the end, those are the basic things we're all wanting. And it's only when we're able to see beyond our judgments of a person as a thing and see them as a relational process in context that we can start to see, well, how could this have come about? How could this have, and then once we've got that, we can start to work with it. We can start to question those authorities, point out other times when they've been deeply inaccurate or whatever. But at least we can do something with it once we understand their context that's driving behaviour.
Okay, thanks.
So, Stu, you put your hand down, and I was kind of really keen to hear from you because
I was just waiting, Paul. First, you know, thank you ever so much for your effort to kind of tell a different story about how we tell stories.
Yeah,
and to bring a relational frame theory to bear on that, you know, what a challenging task. Just a couple of points you were making towards the end. You know, I absolutely, for those in the audience familiar with the matrix, I absolutely agree with you. I think using it in a static way to just ask questions, right, is an idea whose time has passed. And so how we be much more active with that, I think, is really important. And it actually connects up with what you were saying about the Four Noble Truths, because Stephen Batchelor has kind of secularized that into the 4 tasks, but he does it in a way that actually maps very nicely onto the matrix. He uses the acronym ELSA. E is for embrace life. You know, it's CDP1, right? EL, let go of suffering, and not the pain of life, but as you were talking about, the suffering we superimpose through language upon the inevitable pain of life. And if we can let go of that, then we can stop, meditate, notice, pause, and then act, you know, spell it all caps ACT, as in psychological flexibility, or in, you know, the Eightfold Noble Path. But it really maps onto the matrix. And that's really what we want to do, right? We want to be able to look at the way we superimpose suffering and what the consequences of that, how is it functioning? How do we move across the quadrants of the matrix? And then how do we stop and step back from the languaging we're doing and reorient to what matters to us separately and collectively? So I really appreciated your talk, Paul, and I really appreciated the way that you know, you were able to pull it together in a way different, right? More traditional than what Batchelor would do with ELSA, but it really fits, I think, very nicely with the matrix as process, part of the pro-social endeavor. So thanks, Paul. Thanks very much.
I want to just acknowledge Stu as I didn't use this language, but I could have. Stu always talks about matrixing as a behavior rather than the matrix. And I could have just as easily put that on that slide. It would have been excellent. So that's very, very helpful. I think we're going to have time for just maybe one more, Beth. What do you think? Or do we need to wrap up?
I think that let's go for one more. Let's go for one more.
All right.
We've got
Thank you.
3 minutes.
George, you've been patiently waiting. Good to see you again, mate.
Thank you. Same to you. And great talk. I really appreciate it. So I just want to kind of, from the big picture perspective, indigenous wisdom says it is all about connectivity. Yet culture, which is the context we grow up in, divides into us versus them. And I'm curious, do you think being heard, understood, and respected is actually the beginning, the middle, and maybe even the end of the transformation into belonging?
Sounds good to me, George. I'm sorry, I might have run out of steam. I want to acknowledge that I think the relational view that you're pointing to here is ancient wisdom. And my sister and I was hoping my sister would be here, and hopefully she'll see the recording, because we have endless debates about whether this is just a reinvention of indigenous wisdom or a reinvention of Buddhism or something like that. And it is, and it isn't. It's a new way of talking about it. So I definitely feel as though there's something, the relational nature of being is something that's just woven into indigenous cultures in general, generalizing, and not into the West. There's somewhere where we've taken a turn and we've got lost in the word. In the beginning was the word. We've got lost in the dichotomy. And it's becoming more and more so at the cost of us being more and more alienated from the earth. We're living increasingly in this virtual world, the matrix. I don't know. That speak to any of the themes you were pointing to?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. All right, wonderful. I think we should wrap up, and I can see there are additional questions there. My email is paul.atkins@ProSocial.world. Always very, very happy to hear from people if they've got a question. And please come along in 2 weeks' time to Robert's talk, where he's going to hopefully make use of all this to really anchor it in what it means for pro-social and for getting along with one another.
Thank you so much, Paul. And
Thanks,
maybe
Paul.
Robert will let you have a moment in 2 weeks to talk. You know, he might just not.
Yeah, Robert's going to be like, you didn't give me a go.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And Paul, this was amazing. Thank you for such a wonderful and entertaining presentation. Appreciate your sense of humor throughout.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.